which possibly proves Boulatruelle's intelligence. On the afternoon of that same Christmas Day, 1823, a man had walked for rather a long time in the most deserted part of the Boulevard de l'Hôpital in Paris. This man had the air of a person who is seeking lodgings, and he seemed to halt, by preference, at the most modest houses on that dilapidated border of the Faubourg Saint-Marceau. We shall see further on that this man had, in fact, hired a chamber in that isolated quarter. This man, in his attire, as in all his person, realized the type of what may be called the well-bred mendicant, extreme wretchedness combined with extreme cleanliness. This is a very rare mixture which inspires intelligent hearts with that double respect which one feels for the man who is very poor, and for the man who is very worthy. He wore a very old and very well-brushed round hat. A coarse coat, worn perfectly threadbare, of an ochre yellow, a color that was not in the least eccentric at that epoch. A large waistcoat with pockets of a venerable cut. Black breeches, worn grey at the knee, stockings of black worsted, and thick shoes with copper buckles. He would have been pronounced a preceptor in some good family, returned from the emigration. He would have been taken for more than 60 years of age. From his perfectly white hair, his wrinkled brow, his livid lips, and his countenance, where everything breathed depression and weariness of life. Judging from his firm tread, from the singular vigor which stamped all his movements, he would have hardly been thought 50. The wrinkles on his brow were well placed, and would have disposed in his favor anyone who observed him attentively. His lip contracted with a strange fold which seemed severe, and which was humble. There was in the depth of his glance an indescribable melancholy serenity. In his left hand he carried a little bundle tied up in a handkerchief. In his right he leaned on a sort of a cudgel, cut from some hedge. This stick had been carefully trimmed, and had an air that was not too threatening. The most had been made of its knots, and it had received a coral-like head, made from red wax. It was a cudgel, and it seemed to be a cane. There are but few passers-by on that boulevard, particularly in the winter. The man seemed to avoid them rather than to seek them, but this without any affectation. At that epoch, King Louis XVII went nearly every day to Choisy-le-Roi. It was one of his favorite excursions. Towards 2 o'clock, almost invariably, the royal carriage and cavalcade was seen to pass at full speed along the Boulevard de l'Hôpital. This served in lieu of a watch or clock to the poor women of the quarter who said, "It is 2 o'clock. There he is returning to the Tuileries." And some rushed forward, and others drew up in line, for a passing king always creates a tumult. Besides, the appearance and disappearance of Louis XVII produced a certain effect in the streets of Paris. It was rapid but majestic. This impotent king had a taste for a fast gallop. As he was not able to walk, he wished to run. That cripple would gladly have had himself drawn by the lightning. He passed, pacific and severe, in the midst of naked swords. His massive couch, all covered with gilding, with great branches of lilies painted on the panels, thundered noisily along. There was hardly time to cast a glance upon it. In the rear angle on the right there was visible on tufted cushions of white satin a large, firm, and ruddy face. A brow freshly powdered à l'oiseau royal. A proud, hard, crafty eye. The smile of an educated man. 2 great epaulettes with bullion fringe floating over a bourgeois coat. The golden fleece, the cross of St. Louis, the cross of the Legion of Honor, the silver plaque of the Saint-Esprit, a huge belly, and a wide blue ribbon. It was the king. Outside of Paris, he held his hat decked with white ostrich plumes on his knees enwrapped in high English gaiters. When he re-entered the city, he put on his hat and saluted rarely. He stared coldly at the people, and they returned it in kind. When he appeared for the first time in the St. Marceau quarter, the whole success which he produced is contained in this remark of an inhabitant of the Faubourg to his comrade: "That big fellow yonder is the government." This infallible passage of the king at the same hour was, therefore, the daily event of the Boulevard de l'Hôpital. The promenader in the yellow coat evidently did not belong in the quarter, and probably did not belong in Paris, for he was ignorant as to this detail. When, at 2 o'clock, the royal carriage, surrounded by a squadron of the bodyguard all covered with silver lace, debouched on the boulevard, after having made the turn of the Salpêtrière, he appeared surprised and almost alarmed. There was no one but himself in this cross lane. He drew up hastily behind the corner of the wall of an enclosure, though this did not prevent le Duc de Havre from spying him out. Le Duc de Havre, as captain of the guard on duty that day, was seated in the carriage, opposite the king. He said to His Majesty, "Yonder is an evil-looking man." Members of the police, who were clearing the king's route, took equal note of him. One of them received an order to follow him. But the man plunged into the deserted little streets of the Faubourg, and as twilight was beginning to fall, the agent lost trace of him, as is stated in a report addressed that same evening to le Comte d'Angles, Minister of State, Prefect of Police. When the man in the yellow coat had thrown the agent off his track, he redoubled his pace, not without turning round many a time to assure himself that he was not being followed. At 4:15, that is to say, when night was fully come, he passed in front of the theatre of the Porte Saint-Martin, where the Two Convicts was being played that day. This poster, illuminated by the theatre lanterns, struck him. For, although he was walking rapidly, he halted to read it. An instant later he was in the blind alley of La Planchette, and he entered the Plat d'Etaine. The Pewter Platter, where the office of the coach for Lagny was then situated. This coach set out at 4:30. The horses were harnessed, and the travellers, summoned by the coachman, were hastily climbing the lofty iron ladder of the vehicle. The man inquired, "Have you a place?" "Only one, beside me on the box," said the coachman. "I will take it. Climb up." Nevertheless, before setting out, the coachman cast a glance at the traveller's shabby dress, at the diminutive size of his bundle, and made him pay his fare. "Are you going as far as Lagny?" demanded the coachman. "Yes," said the man. The traveller paid to Lagny. They started. When they had passed the barrier, the coachman tried to enter into conversation, but the traveller only replied in monosyllables. The coachman took to whistling and swearing at his horses. The coachman wrapped himself up in his cloak. It was cold. The man did not appear to be thinking of that. Thus they passed Gournay and Neuilly-sur-Marne. Towards 6 o'clock in the evening they reached Chelles. The coachman drew up in front of the Carter's Inn installed in the ancient buildings of the Royal Abbey, to give his horses a breathing spell. "I get down here," said the man. He took his bundle and his cudgel and jumped down from the vehicle. An instant later he had disappeared. He did not enter the inn. When the coach set out for Lagny a few minutes later, it did not encounter him in the principal street of Chelles. The coachman turned to the inside travellers. "There," said he, "is a man who does not belong here, for I do not know him. He had not the air of owning a sou, but he does not consider money. He pays to Lagny, and he goes only as far as Chelles. It is night. All the houses are shut. He does not enter the inn, and he is not to be found. So he has dived through the earth. The man had not plunged into the earth, but he had gone with great strides through the dark, down the principal street of Chelles. Then he had turned to the right before reaching the church, into the crossroad leading to Montfermeil, like a person who was acquainted with the country and had been there before. He followed this road rapidly. At the spot where it is intersected by the ancient tree-bordered road which runs from Gagny to Lagny, he heard people coming. He concealed himself precipitately in a ditch, and there waited until the passers-by were at a distance. The precaution was nearly superfluous, however. For, as we have already said, it was a very dark December night. Not more than 2 or 3 stars were visible in the sky. It is at this point that the ascent of the hill begins. The man did not return to the road to Montfermeil. He struck across the fields to the right, and entered the forest with long strides. Once in the forest he slackened his pace, and began a careful examination of all the trees, advancing, step by step, as though seeking and following a mysterious road known to himself alone. There came a moment when he appeared to lose himself, and he paused in indecision. At last he arrived, by dint of feeling his way inch by inch, at a clearing where there was a great heap of whitish stones. He stepped up briskly to these stones, and examined them attentively through the mists of night, as though he were passing them in review. A large tree, covered with those excrescences which are the warts of vegetation, stood a few paces distant from the pile of stones. He went up to this tree and passed his hand over the bark of the trunk, as though seeking to recognize and count all the warts. Opposite this tree, which was an ash, there was a chestnut tree, suffering from a peeling of the bark, to which a band of zinc had been nailed by way of dressing. He raised himself on tiptoe and touched this band of zinc. Then he trod about for a while on the ground comprised in the space between the tree and the heap of stones, like a person who is trying to assure himself that the soil has not recently been disturbed. That done, he took his bearings, and resumed his march through the forest. It was the man who had just met Cosette. As he walked through the thicket in the direction of Montfermeil, he had espied the tiny shadow moving with a groan, depositing a burden on the ground, then taking it up and setting out again. He drew near, and perceived that it was a very young child, laden with an enormous bucket of water. Then he approached the child, and silently grasped the handle of the bucket.